2 by Tim Winton. Chapter-1 Forest Winter. This day the young man left his wife and child asleep and went out into the forest to see wood. Winter had closed in. The sawing was bitter work, but it had come at the final moment, before they gave up the country and went back north to the city and the hardship of the dog. He drove out in the boss utility, and searched for fallen timber which he could cut into blocks and cart back to the tiny valley to store for the holiday season. The ball of the saw hurt his ears, so that at the end of a day's work his head had the same stuffed feel as it had after a night's playing with the band before everything fell apart. At afternoon he sheltered in utility and ate his lunch of bread and cheese, with the rain trickling down the windows and the quiet of the forest coming upon him. It was lonely in the middle of the day, with no company but the pale trunks of cherry trees. During his morning break, the circumstances of the past few months rested hard on him. When the light was weak, and if the wind was especially hot and cold, he would sit chewing, motionless, almost catatonic from misery. But when it came time to take up the chainsaw again and sharpen its teeth before going back to whichever great dead tree he was dismembering, he knew with certainty that he was still all right, and the fact that he could swill his teeth-dregs into the bracken and raise his haunches with the saw was enough for him to know that he wasn't broken. He had been broken once before years back, when he was still half a boy, and he knew that when you were beaten properly you didn't get up. You had to wait for some obscure grace to put you together, and there was no guarantee it would come by a second time. Most days he returned to the crooked little valley before dusk to see 2 dozen timber cabins, and the shop and the old school and the ruins of the sawmill echoing to the misanthropic calls of magpies. His boss was a retired farmer who had bought the valley years ago, and turned the remains of the logging town into a holiday village for spring and autumn. Summer and winter were extreme down there, and the place deserted but for the owner and his wife and whoever he hired is off-season. It was here the young man and his wife and child found themselves the day the money ran out. By then, they were just driving without a purpose. Too many things had gone against them. The job and the cabin were a sudden mercy. A month after they arrived, the young man came home one evening to find that the stove and the fire were still unlit. The small house was cold and in darkness, and the baby was screaming. Rachel! He found his wife on the mattress on the floor with the child beside her. When he turned the light on, he saw her on her back, mouth wide, struggling to breathe. Her eyes were big in her face. They frightened him. He scrabbled around the bedclothes. The baby squeaked. "Where's the Ventolin? Your inhaler? Where's your inhaler?" The young woman was concentrating too hard on getting air to be able to speak. The noise she made in her throat was like the sound of a bog tearing loose and storm, back and forth creaking. He picked the baby up and took the full force of its squeal in his ear as he flattened it to his shoulder. He found the inhaler on the floor between the tissues and ointments and folded nappies. He felt panic. He brought the inhaler to her mouth with a spare hand, but she pushed it away. That tearing sound faltered for a moment and she managed a single word. "Old!" He looked at the cylinder. It was a pressure pack the size of a bottle cork. He read the expiry date, months too old. It was likely useless, perhaps dangerous. He didn't know. Oh God! He went into the dark kitchen with the baby. Tears and saliva ran down his neck. He wrapped the pink-faced little boy tighter in his blankets and put him in the carry basket. He took the basket out to the car. The sun was well down, but the tops of the carriages were visible in silhouette, and he could still make out the skeleton of the old water tower. For a moment he considered going for a moment he considered going to the bus for the help. It was only a moment. When the child was screaming out in the car, he dressed his wife and wrapped her in blankets and hoisted her up. The nearest town was 25 kilometers east. As the young man dropped the old station wagon hat along the narrow road between the bodies of the trees and the eyes of the feral cats and foxes, he could barely hear the motor over the baby's screams and the pendulous stirring respiration of his wife. Everything was changed. How long had it been since they were happy? The music was gone, the money, and Rachel. What had happened to her? Having the baby had muted her. The forceful, funny girl he had married had suddenly become placid, listless, sickly, as though she had had the life torn from her as well as the child. He was afraid the breaking of things had let that old helpless panic get back into him. Winding down the hill towards the bridge town, he began to sing madly. A frog went walking on a summer day, ahem, ahem. Rachel lay against the seat with her head back, eyes wide. He drove hard. He couldn't let this happen. A scream rose in him, like the night the baby was dragged hollow-chested from her. A frog went walking on a summer's day. He met Miss Mosey on the way. Ahem, 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 ahem. The pharmacist was still inside the shop. The young man could see him moving about, but the doors were locked and closed sign was up. The young man bashed on the door and noticed in the high beam of idling station wagon how cut and crusted his own fingers had become. The pharmacist ignored him. He beat the glass harder. He shook the door until the burglar alarm set to ringing. Setting his white coat, the pharmacist came down the aisle between rows of cough medicines and sweats and stuffed toys. The young man saw he was angry. He thinks I'm a junkie, he thought. He thinks I'm a fucking junkie. In the city, a pharmacist might carry a gun at night, but God, this was the country. He saw the man mouthing words at him. Ventolin, the young man cried back. We want some Ventolin. Turn the lamp off, for God's sakes. Open the bloody door. He looked back in the highlights. Oh, Rachel. The pharmacist stood looking. The young man pointed to the car. Asthma, bogo you, she's sick. His fist rested on the glass and he was stiff. The doors opened a crack. The alarm rang on. It rang in his head, right through him. My wife's got asthma. She can't breathe. She needs Ventolin. Doesn't she carry it? The pharmacist was tall. He squinted. The young man realized the man couldn't see with the car lights in his eyes. It's expired. Look, she's nearly had it. You need a prescription and money. We have got a 9 weeks old baby boy in the back. Or how about my index finger as deposit? Will that do? For Christ's sake. Stay there. Oh, listen to it. When the man came back with the tiny cylinder, the young man snatched it from him and ran to the car. Rachel had begun to sob. It was pitiful. He struck inhaler between her lips and sprayed it. The bitter smell swept out. The baby whimpered hoarsely. He sprayed, catching her on the intake, and again he sank down the seat with the lights on and the motor still running. He saw the pharmacist locking up the alarm date. Late in the evening, the young man sat in the darkness and drank the coarse, volatile claret the locals call the carob syrup. The stuff found a big emptiness in him. Relief had consumed something inside. Mother and baby were asleep on the mattress in the bedroom. He was weary. There were there was a day's work ahead in the morning. He couldn't sleep. Carob syrup puckered his mouth and made his lids fatten. After midnight he reeled out into the still forest night, and saw clouds rustling across the moon above the crowned shadows of the tree. It was an eerie sight, not a flurry where it stood, but up there was a maelstrom. He was grateful for the sight of it. He was thankful for Rachel and the baby. There was something to check himself against, and now he was drunk and would have fallen down asleep in a leaf litter if the cold hadn't driven him into the bed. Before dawn, he walked and crept about in an unaccountably cheerful mood. He drank still cold water and washed his face and looked at his hands in the half light. They were no longer looked like a guitarist's hands, and the fact was suddenly of no consequence. For a while he stood at the bathroom window and watched light and mist and birds moving at the feet of the carriage where bracken and grasses hung sluggish with dew. Then he went to the bedroom where Rachel and the baby were stirring. He took the old kerosene tin they used as a waste paper bin to the kitchen. At the stove, he tipped the contents of the tin into the firebox. The papers were old bills and envelopes, Kleenex and a few crumpled sheets that were his latest clumsy attempts at songwriting. He lit some pine kindling on top and lit it. He went out for more wood. When he opened the firebox again a few minutes later, the blaze exploded in his face with the sound of gunshot. He squealed. In that instant his vision was gone and he fell back against the rickety little table. Jerra! Jerra! What's wrong? What's happened? He felt her propping him up. He felt her propping him up. I can't see, he cried. Nothing. His eyes felt crossed. There was soot and charcoal grit in his mouth. Let me see. Oh, Jesus. Get up. I. Get the hell up, Jerra. Come to the sink. He felt her pinching grip on his forearm. Water was splashed on him. For a moment he saw those clouds rustling across the sky. He felt delirious. Somewhere the baby burbled. He was happy. He felt crazy. Then there was a light, water in his eyes. Better, I don't know. Don't be wait. Is it better or not? Yes. He saw the fogged outline of her arm and for a moment a clear vision of her brown eyes. He listened to her wheeze. In a few minutes he could see properly. Through his eyes felt as though they were full of blast. The kitchen floor was black and with soot, and as far back as the opposite wall, pieces, kindling, and charcoal were strewn about. What was that? Rachel straightened from the firebox, the stove, and held up the distorted remains of the old Ventolin cylinder. She showed him the metal fragments all over the linoleum. Must have tossed it in with the newspaper waste papers, he said. You could have lost your eyes, Jerra. I will be more careful. Out on the back stoop after the breakfast, the young man watched the rain coming in from the south. He heard Rachel coughing as she sang to the child. A frog went quacking on a summer's day, ahem. He sharpened the teeth of the chainsaw and prepared to go out into the day.